Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 2, Conflicts and Challenges in Canada 1800 to 1850. This is Lesson Number 18, How were people affected by the War of 1812 and its outcome? Let's begin today's lesson by considering the following. How do you think the War of 1812 affected non-Caucasian, that means people who are not white, who fought in the war, as well as people who did not fight in the war, such as women and children? Why don't you put the video on pause so that you can consider this question and write down your response, and then we'll talk about this in tomorrow's class. All right, let's proceed. Wars always have short-term and long-term effects. The people who fought in and lived through the War of 1812 were scarred both mentally and physically. The war also marked a major change in the relationships between the First Nations, the British, and the Americans. The long-term effects of the war continue to impact the First Nations today. Some soldiers fought to keep their freedom. For black people living in the Canadas, an American takeover would mean a return to slavery. Richard Pierpont, who we read about earlier, petitioned the military to create a company of black soldiers. The Colored Corps was the first all-black company and fought in several battles. And just as an aside, to use the term colored today to refer to someone who is black or Asian or uh, another skin color is considered highly inappropriate today. But at the time, the term colored corps was actually considered a polite way of referring to this company of black soldiers. But it's not a term that we would use today outside of referring to this group in history class. Each fighting unit had a team of 10 men who were called pioneers. These pioneers were experts in building roads and bridges for the military and repairing forts. Despite their contributions, black soldiers still faced discrimination and, after the war, were given less land and compensation than other soldiers. I just want to direct your attention to this illustration of a black soldier from the War of 1812. My question for you is, what does this painting tell you about the soldier's role? So you may want to put the video on pause so you can take an extended look at this picture and then jot down your ideas about what this painting tells you about the role of this soldier. All right, let's continue. Soldiers experienced harsh conditions. They faced epidemics, including measles, malaria, and smallpox. Soldiers who were ill were still expected to fight in terrible weather conditions. For these reasons, an estimated 1,500 British soldiers deserted the army. If they were captured, they faced whippings, being sentenced to hard labor, or even execution. Thousands of women and children also faced hardships during the war. Thousands of women and children were forced from their homes. They saw their relatives and friends killed, their houses destroyed, and their food stolen by American soldiers. Although the British government offered to compensate people for their losses, the payments came years later and were much smaller than the value of what was lost. Women played a key role in the War of 1812. They took care of homes, children, and farms while their husbands went off to fight. They provided support to soldiers in camps and on the battlefield. They prepared meals and washed and mended uniforms for soldiers. Women acted as nurses, and in some cases, they and their children followed their husbands to the battlefields. So I'll direct your attention to yet another iconic painting. My question is, what message might the artist want to share with us about women's participation in the war effort? So put the video on pause so you can take a longer look at this picture, because tomorrow we'll talk about what the role of women appears to be, or appears to have been, in the war based on this image. All right, let's continue. One woman who has come to be seen as a major hero in the War of 1812 is Laura Secord. When American soldiers occupied the Niagara region, Laura and her husband were forced to take American soldiers into their home. She overheard the soldiers planning to capture the British territory of Beaver Dams. According to legend, Laura walked more than 30 kilometers to the British encampment and warned them of the Americans' plan. When the attack came, the British and natives were well prepared and defeated the Americans easily. In recent years, historians have questioned the accuracy of Laura Secord's involvement in the war. British Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon did not even mention Laura in his official battle report. She did not receive any recognition for her efforts until 1860, when she insisted on being included in an address by the Prince of Wales to a group of War of 1812 veterans. Whether the story of Laura Secord is accurate or not, she is still regarded publicly as a hero. A prime example of this being the chocolate company that wanted to name itself after a Canadian war hero and chose to take Laura's name. So of course, we have the chocolate and ice cream company's logo, but Laura Secord has appeared many times over in other forms of media. One example is this now highly collectible postage stamp depicting Laura's travel through the woods, making her way to the British camp to speak with British Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon. When the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, the British were able to send more reinforcements to fight in the War of 1812. The Americans' hope of taking the Canadas was fading, and their goal was now to protect the territory and independence they had gained during the American Revolution. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814, ending the war. Basically, everything returned to what it was like before the war. The British and Americans agreed to return any lands they had taken from each other during the war, and the border between the US and the Canadas stayed the same. Both the British and the Americans believed they had won the war. Time to look at another iconic painting, this depicting meetings, or one crucial meeting between European representatives at the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. And my question for you is, why do you think there are no First Nations representatives in this painting? So put the video on pause, consider this question, then jot down your thoughts. And moving on. While historians debate who won the war, everyone agrees that the First Nations lost the most. In all, more than 10,000 Native and Métis warriors participated in the war, and their contributions to British victories cannot be overestimated. Despite their contributions, after the war the British were no longer interested in having military alliances with the First Nations, and instead wanted to assimilate the natives and take their land for new settlers. There were no First Nations representatives in attendance when the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and any promises that the British had made to the natives during the war were quickly forgotten. Just think of this picture on the left. First Nations continue to hold protests to raise awareness about unfair land treaties and to demand that the Canadian government negotiate land claims and recognize the needs of First Nations peoples today. Some historians argue that the War of 1812 was a victory for the Americans, and that they defended their independence and gained greater respect from Britain. Other historians state that the British were victors and that they did not lose their colonies, and their reputation as one of the greatest nations in the world was not damaged. Yet another group argued that the War of 1812 was won by Canada. Even though Canada as a country did not exist, the people of Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and the First Nations came together for the first time and defended themselves as a separate people. It could be argued that if it were not for the War of 1812, Canada might not exist today. Just one final picture to look at from the present day. My question for you is, why do you think Canadians like to participate in or watch War of 1812 reenactments? So you can put the video on pause, jot down your ideas, because we'll talk about this tomorrow. All right, then let's finish today's lesson by considering the following. 1. Who do you think was the most affected by the War of 1812? Black people, women, or First Nations peoples? And why do you feel this way? Second question, do you feel there is a winner in the War of 1812? If so, who do you think won the war and why? So, as always, you're going to put the video on pause so you can write down your responses to these two questions. If you don't feel that you're able to do this, it means you need to go back, watch the video at least 2 more times, and then when you're ready, put the video on pause. I look forward to a great discussion around these two questions as well as the questions that were posited earlier in this video. We'll do that during tomorrow's class. But until then, this concludes today's video.